And good afternoon. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is your very tired host, Craig Truglia. And I really felt like I had to do this show on original sin. It's based on research I've done that is going to be in an article that won't be out for a while, but it's going to come on the heels of very important research that I'll be coming out with on St. Nicholas Cabasilas and on St. Dionysius the Areopagite on the issue of purification. And so we need a basis here, which is on original sin. And let me just start simple. This is not a complicated issue. People make it very complicated, and it doesn't have to be. The Orthodox doctrine of original sin could be summed up in a few words. And I'll give you the definition, which is given by Pomazansky in his Orthodox dogmatic theology. Why do I quote Father Michael Pomazansky? The reason is this guy was educated in Tsarist Russia. Then, because Russia lost World War I, he lived in Poland, which was between Weimar, Germany, and the Soviet Union. And so they were really insulated from Western influence and communist influence. And then when the Germans invaded Poland and they lost World War II, he went to America, to Jordanville. So not only that, he then lived in 1988. So here's an example of someone who speaks modern language, who lived in 1988. So it's just not me quoting someone from long ago and not taking into account Orthodox thought in the 20th century. But he's a time capsule. Pomazansky is a time capsule of Orthodox thought before it was overly corrupted by interaction with the West, Western captivity due to the communist yoke, and also issues dealing with the Turks beforehand. So he preserves mainstream Tsarist Russian Orthodox thought, which is extremely fascinating. So what does Father Michael Pomazansky say? And then we're going to show it from the councils and the fathers. So what is Orthodox original sin according to a mainstream Orthodox theologian? For example, and this is in Orthodox dogmatic theology, he affirmed that original sin is hereditary. All right, this is simple stuff, but it's supposed to be simple. So the quote, Pomazansky, original sin is meant the sin of Adam, which was transmitted to his descendants and weighs upon them, right? So it's hereditary, it weighs upon them. He acknowledged that human willing was fundamentally affected by the fall. So this is important because in Western parlance, they say if you have original sin, you have concupiscence. All right, I can never pronounce words. Anyone that knows me well knows that's the case. And so that being said, we've lost camera. Here I am. I'm back. So sorry for that error. So anyway, don't know where I left off, but long story short, human willing has been affected by concupiscence since the fall. And so in Orthodoxy, we don't really use that term because that term translating to Greek is just desire. And there's both good and bad desire. So obviously that confuses people. So that being said, a better term for us to talk about in Orthodox is gnomic willing, right? We're not willing in the natural mode, which is in cooperation with God, growing sanctification. Our gnomic willing is we're constantly this dialectic of oppositions, which means we constantly don't know what's right or wrong. And so we often choose things that are wrong, thinking they're right. And we don't have this stable way of thinking. And so you could just call it concupiscence if that makes you happy. It's pretty much the Eastern paradigm of that Western idea. So the point being is, Pomazansky affirms this was something that occurred from the fall, from original sin. So he writes, after his first fall, man himself departed in soul from God and became unreceptive to the grace of God, which was open to him. He ceased to listen to the divine voice addressed to him, and this led to the further deepening of sin in him. All right. Thus, original sin is understood by Orthodox theology as a sinful inclination which has entered into mankind and become its spiritual disease, right? So he ceased to listen to the divine voice addressed to him. He became unreceptive to the grace of God. Keep that in the back of your mind for a moment. All right, here's another quote. The eating of the fruit was only the beginning of moral deviation, the first push, but it was so poisonous and ruinous that it was already impossible to return to the previous sanctity and righteousness. On the contrary, there was revealed an inclination to travel farther on the path of apostasy from God. The principle of sin immediately entered into man, the law of sin. It struck the very nature of man and quickly began to root itself in him and develop. The sinful inclinations in man have taken the reigning position. Man has become the servant of sin. Both the mind and the feelings have become darkened in him. That's Romans 1. And therefore his moral freedom often does not incline towards the good, but towards evil. Like I said, plain Latin theology, for example, would be concupiscence. It's not a bad word. So he acknowledged, Pomazansky, that human willing was fundamentally affected by the fall. Lastly, Pomazansky taught that this moral fall was a correlative of man's corruption and death. They go hand in hand, right? Man became unreceptive to the grace of God. So if grace upheld your life, then that also makes you die. So sin divorces one from the abiding grace of God, his divine energeia, his energies, which sustains life itself. So Pomazansky says, the physical consequences of the fall are diseases, hard labor, and death. These were the natural result of the moral fall, the falling away from communion with God, man's departure from God. All right. So they're a natural result of the moral fall. Again, nature, important word. If you fall morally, you will corrupt. It's not a punitive punishment imposed upon you. So back to Pomazansky. Man became subject to the corrupt elements of the world in which dissolution and death are active. Nourishment from God, from the source of life, and from the constant renewal of all one's powers became weak in men, right? The source of life, nourishment, you turn away from God morally, you cut yourself off from the divine energeia. With sin, death entered into the human race. Man was created immortal in his soul, and he could have remained immortal also in body if he had not fallen away from God. The wisdom of Solomon says, God did not make death, Wisdom 1:13. And I'm going to put that on the screen for a second, that God did not make death, because this is a very important idea and why the Orthodox doctrine of original sin is so important. All right. God did not make death. So meaning death cannot be, according to Wisdom 1:13, a punishment God imposed upon man for being bad. You are bad, you're punished, now you will die. Rather, it's the natural consequence of not cooperating with God's grace, cutting oneself off from God's divine energeia. So man, by really being fallen, by being immoral, kills himself, right? And so this is an important idea, because I'm going to quote Decree 4 of the Council of Jerusalem in 1672. So I'm going to stop share screen and just put it up on the screen for you guys real fast. And it's going to say that God is not the author of evil. God is in no way the author of evil. All right, so I'm going to make it bigger, and author of evil. There it is. For it is a true and infallible rule that God is in no way the author of evil, nor can it all be just reasoning be attributed to God. So God is not the author of evil. God did not create death, something bad. It's an evil. God did not create that. Jesus Christ, even according to his human nature, was fearful of death. That's a natural good. Death is not supposed to be something that those who are alive want. The natural response is to hate it because it's evil. So God is in no way the author of evil. God could not impose death upon man as a penalty. He did something bad, now you're going to die, and everyone after you, born from you, is going to die, right? God did not impose that upon man. Man imposed it to himself by his disobedience, right? This is super important for people to get, because if we do not understand the energy essence distinction here, right, meaning that the energy of God's what sustains man, the energy of God's what man interacts with God. And it is by turning away from that man loses life, which is participating in the divine energies of God. If we don't understand that, we don't understand original sin. All right. So God is in no way the author of evil. And so God did not oppose death of man. Man opposed it upon himself, and that became hereditary to man because Adam thought waywardly. All who inherited his DNA also think waywardly. They're all cut off from God's divine energeia ultimately. All right. That became darkened in man. So we see this in Pomazansky. The question is, how is this the teaching of the councils? Now, thankfully, we're not talking about an insane amount of stuff that was written on the topic. So I'm going to just quote every conciliar statement on original sin, and we're going to unpack it from the fathers. All right. So we're going back to the big screen. And so the first council to make any sort of statement on original sin was the Council of Carthage. All right. And the Council of Carthage said that infants should be baptized even though they have sinned in nothing apart from which proceeds from the flesh of Adam. So, right, they're sinless, but yet they're not. That's the point. This is because, quoting the council, they've received the contagion of ancient death through birth. So here's a conciliar statement. It's by Canon 2 of the Council of Truglia. This council is considered canonical. The whole point would be that original sin exists, original sin is hereditary. All right. So this is not of question for Orthodox. No surprise, modern Orthodox theologian, Father Michael Pomazansky, talks about this. Now, a later local council of Carthage in 419 elaborated further. In its 110th canon, it states that whosoever denies that infants newly from their mother's womb should be baptized, or says that baptism is for remission of sins, but they derive from sin, from Adam, no original sin, let him be anathema. So we see there that original sin is hereditary. This is what the council in its 110th canon explicitly says. So we Orthodox obviously have to accept this, not that complicated. Now, another issue, though, is we actually have the minutes of this council, at least in part, because St. Augustine quotes it. So in his book on original sin, book 2 in chapter 3, St. Augustine quotes St. Bishop Aurelius of Carthage, who states the following during the council. He says, this is Aurelius, "My affirmation is that although Adam, as created in paradise, is said to have been made immortal at first, he afterwards became corruptible through transgressing the commandment." So what brought about death? Transgressing the commandment. That's what brings corruptibility. So does he directly address the issue that it was punitive or not, that God is the author of evil and imposed death on man because of transgressing the commandment, or rather because he transgressed, through transgressing, corruptibility occurred? All right, that's the interpretation Pomazansky I just gave seems more consistent with the plain language of the council. But granted, that's just a very short statement from it. So let's now go to the Council of Ephesus, an ecumenical council. Canon 1 of the council, it condemns the doctrines of Celestius. Now, granted, the canons were made during by St. Justinian, so they're taking minutes of the council and calling them canons. It's not like they decreed them as canons, as far as I remember. But point being is, who is Celestius? Celestius is a follower of Pelagius, and they deny the existence of original sin. So the existence of original sin and the excommunication, the anathematization of those that deny original sin is canonical in Orthodoxy, because it's Canon 1 of the Council of Ephesus. But interestingly enough, this is not the only time it comes up in the Council of Ephesus. It actually comes up in the minutes of the council for those who have read the minutes. They just were translated to English like 2 months ago. So I've read them. And so I could tell you that, yes, this council does actually talk about original sin in passing. During the July 10th session in 431 AD, the Arcadius, he's a legate for St. Pope Celestine of Rome, states the following. It's in the 32nd paragraph, the July 10th session. He says, "Just as the ancient serpent wormed his way in and seduced the well-regulated thoughts attuned to God of the human race, so he, Nestorius that is, having forgotten his own salvation, eternal life, and afflicted by ignorance of the traditions of the fathers, brought about his own ruin through his disbelief. So again, a passing statement, not a lot of detail, but we know this: man before the fall had well-regulated thoughts, because before the ancient serpent wormed his way in, it says Adam had well-regulated thoughts attuned to God, right? Man according to nature is made to cooperate with God's will and grow in sanctification, right? It is through the fall that we don't do this reflexively. And so it's interesting because he says Nestorius brought about his own ruin through disbelief. Well, how's that correspond with Adam? Through disbelieving God's commandment and forgetting his own salvation, eternal life, he now brought upon himself death. So that is the implication, right? Brought about his own ruin. Well, Adam brought upon his own ruin. So again, not explicit that there's nothing punitive going on, but it lends more credibility to the side that I just gave you, Father Michael Pomazansky. This Orthodox take is the simpler explanation of what we read here in this council. Well, after that, really, the next time there are real comments on the issue of, and if there's volume issues, guys, just let me know. Real comments on the issue of original sin is in 1642, the Synod of Jassy, which is a pan-Orthodox synod, which was accepted by Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, as well as Kiev, pretty much the Russian church. It was an acceptance of St. Peter Mogila's Catechism. He speaks at some length about this issue. It's in like pages 28, 31 of the 1898 edition, which is for free online. So what's St. Peter Mogila say? We start seeing fleshed out the things I was inferring from those earlier conciliar statements. So St. Peter Mogila says, Adam had a perfect knowledge of God. Therefore, knowing God, he knew all the things through God, right? Like I said, well-attuned thoughts, right? So you have perfect knowledge of God. That's pretty big words. By sinning, he came into a state of sin, and being expelled from paradise, he became subject to death, right? So by sinning, right, he came into a state of sin. So that's what is state of sin. That's original sin, obviously, and the results of that, right? The effects, which would be corruption of death and gnomic willing, right? Concupiscence, this wayward way of thinking. All right. And he continues, presently losing the perfection of his reason, right? Perfectly knowing God, perfection of his reason and understanding, his will became prone to evil rather than good. So we're seeing his definition again, all the same stuff we see in Pomazansky, right? So the 1642 Pan-Orthodox Council also states a doctrine of original sin that we see in Pomazansky, that yes, it affects how people will, right? So we have a later statement where St. Peter Mogila says, we are conceived in our mother's womb and born in this sin. He means original sin. Man was free from all sin, and through Adam became guilty. We all likewise, who descend from him, become also guilty. This is called original sin because no mortal conceived without this depravity of nature. So what's he saying here? It's important. What he's saying, one, it's hereditary, and two, its guilt is not actually like the punishment or the punitive nature. It's a depravity of nature. This is his own words. So we often call this inherited guilt, right? That's like the doctrine of St. Augustine. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on it. People accuse Roman Catholics of having this doctrine, though in modern times they don't. Their catechism teaches against it. The point is, we don't believe in inherited guilt, as Roman Catholics don't do anymore. We believe what's inherited is a depravity of nature. So that's clearly what he means by guilty, because that's what he explains, St. Peter Mogila. St. Peter Mogila continues, he says, reason, whilst man remains in the state of innocence, that is before the fall, was perfect and uncorrupt, and by the fall became corrupt. But his will became more inclined to evil. The will is miserably depraved by original sin. All right, so man was in a state of innocence and incorruption, but man's will, by being corrupted, led to corruption and inclination towards evil. So again, all the stuff we just talked about in that council. Now, there's decades later, the Council of Jerusalem in 1672, Pan-Orthodox as well. So those that say the Orthodox don't have teaching on this, we're finding thus far that's really not true. They've got some pretty clear teachings on original sin, and they use the word original sin. So Decree 6 of the Council I'm going to read it. Actually, I'm going to put it on the screen. So let me share it real quick. And you have to pay careful attention to Decree 6 because you could very easily misunderstand it. All right. So I'm going to read slowly and explain. So Decree 6, the council, I just want to make sure in my notes where it goes. We believe, right? So this is all right here. We believe the first man created by God to have fallen in paradise when, disregarding the divine commandment, he yielded to the deceitful counsel of the serpent. I'm just going to stop there for a second, right? The serpent used deceit because man had perfect knowledge, perfect willing. He was made naturally to cooperate with the grace of God. So he couldn't just sin, just like will the sin. That's impossible. And we're going to read that in the Saints. He had to be deceived, all right? And as a result of hereditary sin flowed to his posterity, so that everyone who's born after the flesh bears this burden and experiences the fruits of it in this present world. The fruits, right? So everyone I got my words mixed up. Inherits original sin by experiencing its fruits. But by these fruits and this burden, we do not understand actual sin, such as impiety, blasphemy, murder, sodomy, adultery, fornication, enmity, and whatever else is by our depraved choice committed contrarily to the divine will, not from nature. This is very important. We do not inherit guilt, and we do not inherit an inclination where we have no choice but to sin. That otherwise Theotokos and John the Baptist and Jeremiah and sinless infants would have knowingly committed sins, which they did not. All right. So man did not, they inherited fallenness, right? As it's said here, the fruits of what Adam did, the effects, right? But not actual guilt of sin, not an actual forced inclination to sin. We did not lose the image of God in us. It gives us the ability, the will, cooperate the will of God. So anyway, for many, both of the forefathers and the prophets and vast numbers of others, as well as those under the shadow of the law, as well as under the truth of the gospel, such as the divine precursor, that's John the Baptist, and especially the mother of God, the Word, the ever Virgin Mary, did not experience these sins or such like faults. All right, so this is an important statement because he's saying, well, there's sinless people, and probably what they have in mind is Job, Jeremiah, right, under the law, though, John the Baptist. And then you have under the truth, rather be John the Baptist and the Theotokos, right? They are sinless, but not without sin. That's what people don't get, think the Western paradigm. They didn't commit any acts of sin by stupendous grace and there's just stupendous holiness. I can't even imagine it. But they did not, they didn't commit sin, but they inherited the same thing Adam gives them and gave us. All of us have the same thing. So they inherited the fruits of sin. Well, how do we know that? Let's read the next sentence. But only what the divine justice inflicted upon man as punishment for the original transgression, such as sweats and labor, afflictions, bodily sicknesses, pains in childbearing, finally, while on our pilgrimage to live a laborious life, and lastly, bodily death. Right? So they didn't inherit the guilt of sin. They weren't forced to sin, but they did inherit the consequences of sin, like the natural passions. There's exceptions to this. Obviously, Mary did not have pain in childbearing. That's not the point of this. And this decree is not passing direct comment on whether the Theotokos experience concupiscence in some sort of way. I presume it just presumes upon they all did because she lumps her together with them as having inherited the original sin and the fruits of sin. Well, what are fruits in this decree? Fruit means interior reality. How do we know? When we go to Decree 13, I put Decree 3. When we go to Decree 3, we see the way fruits is used. But on the contrary, speak about faith and works, we believe that it's not the corrective of faith that is works, but the faith which is in us justifies through works with Christ. But we regard works not as witnesses certifying a calling, but as being fruits in themselves, which faith becomes efficacious. All right, so faith, the works are the interior reality of that faith when it becomes manifested, right? So it's the substance of faith are these works, and it perfects faith. So when we inherit the fruits of original sin, the effects of original sin, what we have is the interior reality of Adam's bad decision, but not the actual sin of it, the outward manifestation. So it's a very consistently used word. It makes perfect sense with Decree 6. Now let's read Decree 14 because it talks more about original sin. We believe man and fallen by the original transgression to have become comparable and similar to the beast. That is, to have been utterly undone and to have fallen from his perfection and impassibility. Again, perfect knowledge, we read in St. Peter Mogila. Yet not to have lost the nature and power which he had received from the supremely good God. All right, so meaning we did not lose the image of God. We could still do God's will. For otherwise, he would not be rational, consequently not human. So this is in response to Calvinism, if you're wondering what they're focusing upon. So anyway, so he still has the same nature in which he was created and the same power of his nature, that is free will, living and operating, so that he is by nature able to choose and do what is good and to avoid and hate what is evil. All right. So for it is absurd to say that the nature which was created good by him, who is supremely good, lacks the power of doing good. Right. So man is not completely or totally depraved. For this would be to make the nature evil. And what could be more impious than that? Human nature isn't evil, it's created good, right? For the power of working depends upon nature, and nature upon its author, although in a different manner, and that a man is able by nature to do what is good. Even our Lord himself intimates by saying, even the Gentiles love those that love them, right? Which is important, because I'd actually wonder about this when I'd see like unbelievers, like in foreign countries that are pagans, they're still got good human nature. They can still do good things, all right? So it's interesting that he says later on, although being done by nature only intending to form the natural character of the doer, but not the spiritual, it does not itself contribute to salvation without faith, right? So even though you're good, you can't do God's will without faith, nor does it lead to condemnation, for it's not possible that good as such can be the cause of evil, but in the regenerated, what is wrought by grace and with grace makes the doer perfect and renders him worthy of salvation. A man, therefore, before he is regenerated, is able by nature to incline to what is good and to choose and work moral good, but for the regenerated to do spiritual good. For the works of the believer being contributory to salvation, wrought by supernatural grace, and are properly called spiritual, remember what we read in Decree 13, is necessary they be guided and preceded by grace, as has been said in treating of predestination. Consequently, he's not able himself to do any work worthy of the Christian life, although he has it in his power to will and not to will, to cooperate with grace. All right? So regeneration is the grace of God. It is in our ability to cooperate with the grace is the Orthodox doctrine. Okay? So that is actually not the last pan-Orthodox statements on this issue of original sin. Just so you know, it talks about later in that about infants needing baptism to undo original sin. So that the word in Decree 16, original sin, is also in that council. St. Philaret of Moscow, in his longer catechism in the 1800s, in 1830, is our last, I would say, pan-Orthodox statement on this topic, because it was received throughout the whole church. To quote another 19th century theologian, Philip Schaff, it was the most authoritative doctrinal standard of the Orthodox Greco-Russian Church, and has practically superseded the older Catechism of Orthodox Confession of Mogila. So this is the last pan-Orthodox statement on the issue of original sin we have. Question 158 says, the devil deceived Eve and Adam and induced them to transgress God's commandment. So like I spoke about earlier, they were deceived, and that's why they transgressed, right? They had perfect knowledge, as we read in St. Peter Mogila. They weren't going to choose the wrong thing without deception. Question 160 says that eating from the tree knowledge of evil brought death to man. It says, because it involved disobedience to God's will, and so separated man from God and his grace and alienated him from the life of God. Now, this is important. Remember what I was saying, that death and the Orthodox doctrine of original sin is not punitive. It is the natural result of turning away from God, from turning away from his divine energies. So we see that right here. Because it involved disobedience of God's will, eating the fruit, it's, it pretty much, and so separated man from God and his grace and alienated him from the life of God. So the exact same thing from Pomazansky, no big surprise, because he probably had to study this when he went to seminary in Russia, is in the longer catechism. Question 162, says that God of his goodness at the creation of man gave him a will naturally disposed to love God, but still free, and man used this freedom for evil, right? So what we said in St. Peter Mogila on perfect knowledge, right? A will naturally disposed to love God. So this is what man had before the fall. Question 166 says, what is the death which came from the sin of Adam? It is twofold: bodily, when the body loses the soul which quickened it, and spiritual, when the soul loses the grace of God, which quickened it with the higher and spiritual life. So, right, he teaches that nomic willing, right, like the will loses the grace of God, and the body loses the grace of God. This is the death of Adam from the sin, both spiritual and physical. So again, that idea of this punitive nature that exists in perhaps scholastic Roman Catholicism, not all Roman Catholics believe this, by the way, that original sin only passes on the soul, not the body, does not make sense within the Orthodox paradigm. Thankfully, not all Roman Catholics have that view, because it would be another impediment between Roman Catholics and Orthodox having agreement. Question 168 states that original sin is hereditary. St. Philaret wrote, because all have come of Adam since his infection by sin, and all sin themselves, as from an infected source, there naturally flows an infected stream. And so from a father infected with sin and consequently mortal, there naturally proceeds a posterity infected like him with sin and like him mortal. All right, so all the stuff for Pomazansky is clearly in all the conciliar documents of the church, and you just saw me go through the whole history of every conciliar document on this issue. So congratulations, you now know it all. We have important teachings from the fathers that will now fill in those gaps. You go, well, Craig, you're making a lot of inferences there. These are inferences that are sometimes explicit in those sources in different councils and explicit in the fathers. So, for example, St. Justin Martyr says that man was made, this is Dialogica Trifo, chapter 88, for God, wishing both angels and men who were endowed with free will and at their own disposal to do whatever he had strengthened each to do, made them so that if they choose the things acceptable to himself, he would keep them free from death and from punishment, and that they did evil, he would punish each as he sees fit. So the language is clearly punitive, but we do see he's teaching that Adam had a free will inclined towards cooperating with the grace of God, and that in so doing, it would keep him free from death, right? So is punishment figurative, or is this literally punitive thing given the man, which would contradict Wisdom 113 that says God's not the author of death, and what we read in the Council, not the author of evil. Let's see what other fathers say that get into more detail. So we're going to read St. Gregory of Nyssa, and this is going to take a little more careful paying attention because he's kind of dense. All right, so St. Gregory of Nyssa says in chapter 8 of the Great Catechism, this liability to death then taken from the brute creation was provisionally made to envelop the nature created for immortality. All right, so provisionally means temporarily. It enwrapped it externally, right? The body dies, but not internally. The soul doesn't die, right? This is why he's talking about it, because souls are immortal, even, wicked people. It grasped the sentient part of man, right? So man's thinking now has been affected, but lay no hold upon the divine image, right? He hasn't been totally corrupted, like we read about in the Council of Dositheus. This sentient part, however, does not disappear, but is dissolved, all right? So the sentient part, the sensations, man's physical body corrupts and dies, but does not completely disappear. He has bones. He has a soul, all right? Anyway, we see later in chapter 8 of the Great Catechism, the cause of this dissolution is evident, according to St. Gregory of Nyssa, since both soul and body have a common bond of fellowship in their participation of the sinful affections, right? Bond, right? Together. There's also an analogy between the soul's and the body's death. For as in regard to the flesh, we pronounce the separation, the sentient life to be death. So in respect to the soul, we call the departure of the real life death. While then, as we said before, the participation evil observable in both soul and body is one and of the same character, for it is through both that the evil principle advances into actual working. The death of dissolution, which came from that clothing of dead skins, does not affect the soul. All right, so we see that because both soul and body do what's wrong, both soul and body die. But the soul dies according to its reason, not like its substance. The soul lives on, but the body dissolves. All right, the body corrupts. So like I said, they're intertwined in the thought of St. Gregory of Nyssa. Now, St. Gregory of Nyssa calls, in Against Eunomius, Book 2, Chapter 12, original sin a diseased condition of the will, right? So this Orthodox view of concupiscence is very clear. It's not a bad word, concupiscence. We believe original sin gives you that. But we see also, he says that death is essentially not judicial, it's a natural consequence of cutting oneself off from God's vivifying grace, from his divine energy. So in Against Eunomius, Book 12, Chapter 12, Book 2, Chapter 12, same one, he says, humanity once revolted through malice of the enemy and brought into bondage to sin was also alienated from the true life, right? So when you revolt against God, you turn away from his divine energies that alienates you from life. That's why we die. Now, St. John of Damascus makes this a little clearer for us. He gives us this kind of Expedition Orthodox Faith in Book 2, Chapter 11. It gives us this gloss of what God meant when he said, of every tree in paradise you may freely eat, in Genesis 2:16. So what did God mean according to St. John of Damascus? Through all my creations, you are to ascend to me, your creator, and of all the fruits you may pluck one, that is myself, who art the true life. Let everything bear for you the fruit of life, and let participation in me be the support of your own being, for in this way you will be immortal. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat of it. From the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. For sensible food is by nature for the replenishing of that which gradually wastes away, and it passes into the drought and perishes. And he cannot remain incorruptible who partakes of sensible food. So in short, when Adam and Eve leaned upon God for their life, fed upon God for their life, and cooperated with God's grace, that way they'd be immortal. When they sought to feed themselves, to be their own source of life by picking the fruit themselves, that's why they died. So we see that what I've been saying all along is very clear in St. John of Damascus. In Book 4, Chapter 13, he just says very plainly, he, that's Adam, transgressed the command of his creator and became liable to death and corruption. All right, so transgression brings death and corruption. Now, St. Maximus the Confessor, I find to be even more succinct, though he sounds quite a bit more dense. But in the Ambiguo of John 10:60, Maximus says, if instead of his wife he had trusted God, that's Adam, and been nourished from the tree of life, he would not have lost the gift of immortality, which is maintained perpetually through participation in life. Right? That's obedience to God. So extremely clear. It's been maintained by perpetually participating in God. That's what he's saying. The first man fell away from divine life and embarked upon a different life, which engenders death, a life in which he acquired for himself an irrational form. So death and acquiring a rational form, we're seeing dissolution of the body and the losing of proper use of reason as hand in hand in the fathers. We see that he says all mankind dies because he manifests the sinfulness of Adam. So it's not like we die because we inherited a punishment, right? It's not punitive. God did not create death, like it says in Wisdom 13. Rather, we die because we inherit the sinfulness of Adam, the waywardness. That's how the Theotokos died, though she never sinned, right? It's just having this condition of the will, this gnomic willing, where we're not naturally disposed to cooperate with the grace of God, as in the fallen nature, not nature. Ambiguo to John 22, it says, in the same manner, but in the case of what is contrary, the sages give the names of perdition, Hades, son of perdition, and the like, to those who by their disposition have set themselves on a course to non-existence, and who by their mode of life have reduced themselves to virtual nothingness. He says in 7:11 ambigua to John that man voluntarily brings about his dissolution. In 35:2, he says that a willful turning from God, who willed to impart himself without defilement to them, in a manner proportionate to all and to each, bestowing upon each the power to exist and to remain in existence, right? So God gives to all the power to exist and remain in existence, right? But you must accept it, right? So all die or go into a course of non-existence by turning away from it. This is clearly the teaching of Maximus. So having that diseased will is why man dies. Now, we saw in St. Justin Martyr a little earlier that the natural condition, man was immortal because we were endowed free will to do whatever he had strengthened each to do. So we see this idea that man was created with perfect knowledge, like we see in St. Peter Mogila, all over the Fathers very early on. So in St. Irenaeus' demonstration of apostolic preaching in paragraph 11, he says Adam was free and self-controlled. Same centuries, the Old and Second century. St. Theophilus of Antioch concurred, saying, "For God made man free and with power over himself." That's to Autolycus, Book 2, Chapter 27. St. Clement of Alexandria said Adam was adapted to the reception of virtue, right? He was made naturally to cooperate with the will of God. St. Gregory of Nyssa and On the Making of Man, Chapter 27, St. Maximus and Big of John 45:3 say that man was not subject to or devoid of flux, meaning nomic willing. This was not in existence before the fall. This came to existence after the fall. And I'm just putting myself in. All right, telling my wife about the baby. And that being said, I don't think my wife heard me. Let me say louder. I'm still in mute. Sorry, I'm still in mute. I'm going to start from the beginning again. So it's funny because St. Irenaeus actually said that it was impossible to intentionally defy God and work evil before the fall. So in paragraph 14 of the demonstration of apostolic preaching, St. Irenaeus says it was not possible for them to conceive and understand anything of that which by wickedness through lust and shameful desires is born in the soul. Right? It's not possible. For they were at that time entire, preserving their own nature, since they had the breath of life, which was breathed on their creation. And while this breath remains in its place and power, it has no comprehension and understanding of things that are base. Right? So the breath of life not only keeps them from corrupting, it makes them unable to have nomic willing. But when you're cut off from that breath of life, the opposite occurs. So this is not St. Maximus coming up with something later. We lost viewers, we lost volume. Let me know if volume is good now, and we'll take that from there. And if you have any questions, you could start asking questions on this issue. But that being said, we have this clearly from St. Irenaeus that man before the fall could not sin intentionally. It wasn't possible. You could not die. It wasn't possible. Okay? So the question is, how did Adam fall then? We have an answer to this. St. John Damascus in Book 3, paragraph 20, the Exposition of Orthodox Faith says, the wicked one then made this assault on Jesus from without, not by thoughts prompted inwardly, just as it was with Adam, right? So Adam wasn't able to be tempted inwardly. If you go, Craig, you're reading this wrong, read Dr. Heidgerken's thesis. He's a Roman Catholic theologian. He's the guy who turned me on to this, all right? So I didn't invent this. So the point is, for it was not by inward thoughts, but by the serpent that Adam was assailed, right? So Adam had an external assault, only a suggestion to sin. He had to be deceived. But the Lord repulsed the assault, unlike Adam, and dispelled it like vapor, in order that the passions which assailed him and were overcome might be easily subdued by us, and that the new Adam should save the old. The same thing, by the way, is in St. Augustine on the Trinity, Book 4, paragraph 17, St. Gregory the Great, and Gospel of Matthew, homily 16, Morality on Job, Book 3, paragraph 30. So this is something that's found also in Western Fathers. It's a common idea. So anyway, we see other fathers talking about this. How was Adam deceived? How did Adam fall when he can't naturally sin? Right? What we find is man had to be sensual. He had to imagine images, right? He had to pretty much take his mind off God, right? God is not, a picture, so to say. He's not a feeling, so to say. His essence is simple. So man had to form an image in his mind to turn away from God's energies, to think about sensible things that aren't eternal. So St. Maximus says in Questions Thalassius 21:4, they, the demons, therefore assailed him, that's Christ, hoping they might prevail upon him through his natural passibility to form an image in his mind of an unnatural passion and act on it as they would. You see, that's why we Orthodox don't pray imagining things. That's why St. John the Latter says we can't do this. And Father Schupin's book talks about this. We just had Father Schupin on not a long time ago. Is because sin comes into the mind by inward suggestions that are through imagination. All right. St. Maximus gets into more detail. 65:7 questions Thalassius. The movement of the intellect that gives a form to the passions and fashions beautiful images that give pleasure to the senses. For no passion would ever arise without the intellect's conceptual capacity to fashion such forms. Right? This is why we do not, you could pray the rosary technically as in the prayers, but you cannot pray it in the fashion Roman Catholics would recommend if you understand patristic teaching. Okay? Because that's how original sin occurred. Was through Eve saw the apple and saw it was good to the eyes. Right? She started imagining, oh, this looks good. The moment that occurred, the fall into sin occurred. We'll have a different episode talking about the actual scriptures. I wanted to give you the patristic background so that way when I read the Bible, you're not like, oh, he's just making it up. In Questions Thalassius 50:11, Maximus gets more into how sense perception creates the fall. So he says, in every passion and naturally rules, and just so you know, passion in Orthodoxy is concupiscence. It's the reception of concupiscence we call passions. So in every passion, it naturally rules and leads the corresponding organ of sense perception. For without a substrate, right, sense perception, imagination, to attract the powers of the soul towards him by means of sensation, no passion could ever come into existence. So concupiscence comes from imagination and sense perception. This is from St. Maximus. We also see that this talked about in Questions Thalassius 61 Scholia 1. He says, pleasure and pain were not created together with the nature of the flesh, right? As in, we weren't born this way, right? Nature, the feel, sense perception, good or bad, doesn't exist by nature like that. Not, again, I don't know exactly what our senses are in the prelapsarian state, but it was not pleasure and pain. It's dispassion. That's why, like, God looks angry in the icons, right? Because he's dispassionate. That's why the saints look so serious. Instead, the transgression conceived both the former, resulting in the corruption of free choice, right? So once you conceive sin, pleasure and pain, our free choice, our free will becomes corrupted, becomes gnomic willing. And the latter resulting in the condemnation and dissolution of nature, right? So gnomic willing, fallen will, and dissolution of nature, as in we die, right? That's what happens from transgression. So that pleasure would bring about the soul's voluntary death through sin. So pleasure and pain brings death, and it also brings the loss of proper willing. So not my opinion when I was reading the councils that these things were hand in hand. This is very clear in the teaching of the saints. For example, when it comes to gnomic willing, Maximus says that what Adam did created a chaotic and roaring ocean of material attachments, submerged in temptations, overwhelmed by the great wave of evil, pressing down on its power of reason. Right? Man lost proper use of reason. All right? But it's through material attachment, sensuality, imagination. This is very, very important if you want to understand the Orthodox doctrine. And I see some good comments there, so I do want to get into that. And so the last thing is original sin is hereditary, particularly through sex, through animal mode of relations. I'll just read a few quotes. St. Gregory Nyssa on the Making of Man, chapter 18, paragraph 2 says, all these and the like affections enter man's composition by reason of the animal mode of generation, right? Sensuality, right? That's what passes on original sin. That's why our mitochondrial DNA decays and we age and we die. Augustine on Marriage and Concupiscence, book 1, chapter 13. Everyone who's born of sexual intercourse is in fact sinful flesh, since that alone, which was not born of such intercourse, was not sinful flesh. All right, so I think that's pretty clear. St. Maximus, Questions of Thalassius 21, Scholia 4. If human nature in the first man had not sinned, the multiplication of the human race would have proceeded not through the union of bodies, which is the penalty of sin, right? Because it's sensual, but in a miraculous and divine manner without the contamination of any seed. So, right? Even if you're the Theotokos, you're born of seed, you will have original sin, even though you are sinless in every other way, right? Never willed sin. So why do I care so much about this? Pomazansky, and guys, have your questions ready, and I'm writing questions. If you have it, Pomazansky says very clearly, Father Michael Pomazansky, he's not a saint, that the doctrine of original sin has great significance in the Christian worldview because upon it rests a whole series of other dogmas, right? So if it's Calvinism, obviously, total depravity doesn't work with the Orthodox doctrine of original sin, right? It wouldn't work. Otherwise, man would lose what is good. He'd lose his nature. He wouldn't be man anymore. You couldn't cooperate with the grace of God if there's total depravity. You couldn't have God's energies and actually live forever. So that's the problem with total depravity. But it also doesn't work with one view, Roman Catholic view. I'm not going to say all Roman Catholic views. The view that original sin is separate from the corruption of the body, that you could inherit a fallen will, but not inherit a fallen will. The soul could be sinless, but some of the body could still be of Adam and die. That doesn't work either if we understand the conciliar teaching of the church and the teaching of the fathers. And so that would be an issue for certain people that believe the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary in Roman Catholicism that say Mary died. But that's not the majority position of Roman Catholics. Most believe she didn't die specifically for that reason, because whether they know it or not, they have the correct view of original sin. All right. So that's the difference. There's those who say Mary died because they have the wrong view of original sin. And there's those who say, no, Mary didn't die. I'm speaking of Roman Catholics, not Orthodox, because they have the correct view of original sin. So the point of this whole show ultimately is a couple things. One, the Orthodox doctrine is simple. Original sin is real. It is hereditary. It affects how we feel, how we think, but we don't totally lose our ability to exercise our free will. But because our will is fallen, we are not totally cooperating with the grace of God, who is life himself, like it says in John 14:6. And by so doing, we corrupt and die. Our will corrupts, our bodies corrupt. They are hand in hand because of the energy essence distinction. That's the Orthodox doctrine. There you go. So being that that's the case, some Roman Catholics maybe not will affirm the energy essence distinction, but every other distinctive there, then that's good. The point of this is not to say one side's completely wrong because they don't have a defined side. I would actually be interested to know whether their ecumenical councils, the Western councils, went into the details that St. Peter Mogila, St. Philaret of Moscow, and the Council of Dositheus went into, or the Council of Jerusalem 1672, the Confession of Dositheus went into. Because we defined the doctrine of original sin in the second millennium really with no confusion. It's all laid out. It spells out what we read in the Fathers. All right? So we'll get into questions and comments. This may be too heavy of an issue for people to maybe say too much on. And Red Ribbon said, you just described the prayers of Ignatius of Loyola. I don't know much about it. I presume you're saying the Orthodox view of not imagining or whatever is something Ignatius of Loyola would teach. And that's a good thing. I mean, obviously, right, wasn't he the founder of the Jesuits? He was very educated. So if you read the Fathers, it's hard not to take that view. I mean, it's warned against in St. John the Latter. So people forget how much of Roman Catholic belief and and practice comes really even after the 17th century, right? It comes after St. Ignatius, their St. Ignatius of Loyola. A lot of it's in 18th century France, 19th century Western Europe, and that became the Roman Catholic norm. Orthodox norms are quite a bit older, right? We're reading councils in the 1600s and then a document 1800s and a whole bunch of stuff from 2nd century, right? So the Orthodox stuff's a lot older. While doesn't mean Roman Catholics have completely forfeited all of that, because I just told you there's those who believe the Immaculate Conception that affirm Mary never died because they have the correct view of original sin. But there are issues that have crept into like the certain rosary practices, certain prayer practices, which would actually be in utter opposition to St. Maximus. And that's a big problem. Roman Catholics formative centuries after Council of Trent in response to Protestantism really didn't have St. Maximus translated, so they couldn't really use his understandings, and he spells it out most specifically. Though, like I showed, it's also in St. Gregory of Nyssa, it's also in St. Irenaeus, but also demonstration apostolic preaching wasn't discovered till the 19th century. So Roman Catholicism already got their practices evolved before that was discovered. St. Gregory of Nyssa might have not been translated by then, I don't know. So people forget a lot of that. John Fisher, whose show I was on last week, and he made a great and nifty, for my show on the Council of Dositheus, Council of Jerusalem, 1672, he made a great nifty shaky screen for me, and I'll be on his channel tomorrow, God willing, and we'll discuss the issue of marriage. The Anglican, Orthodox, Roman Catholic confession. So please check out John Fisher 2.0's channel if you're interested in how the different communions approach married bishops, unmarried bishops, etc. So he says, is it possible to experience pleasure or pain in a dispassionate sense? For instance, contemplating about the subject and then gaining the apprehension of goodness or evil of that event or thing. Now, this is where I'm going to say, maybe you're too smart for me. All right. The book of Revelation says that there'll be no more tears, right? There'll be no more pain. So the glorified impassible body, right? Christ voluntarily took on a passible body, a body that could experience natural passions, which in the glorified state it can't. That there can't be pain. It's not possible, right? Christ literally has his wounds in his side and they don't hurt him. But we know food exists. So the question is, what is pleasure? And I don't know. As in, we know it's dispassionate. So it's not pleasure as we know of pleasure. That's all I can tell you. I know food exists. St. Irenaeus even says, quoting St. Papias, that food tastes good. He says the grapes in heaven will taste good. How do they taste good? I would say not in the sense we think of tasting good. It wouldn't be in the sense of imagination and sensuality. So, right, when Christ ate fish, right, when Christ was resurrected, he ate fish. It obviously tasted like something. How did the glorified body, taste buds, receive that and send that to the brain as, a neurochemical response? I don't know. So I'm sorry that's not more of an answer. I have this question. What is the Orthodox view of Ezekiel 44? I'm going to guess it's him that sinneth shall die. I'm just going to double check that I have the right passage here. Of course, I spell Ezekiel wrong because I wish I had the scriptures memorized. No, it's not. I don't even know what you're talking about. Ezekiel 44. It sounds like the Virgin Mary. He says, then he brought me back to the outer gate, because that's Ezekiel 18, him that sinneth shall die. Then he brought me back to the outer gate, the sanctuary which faces east was shut. The Lord said to me, this gate shall remain shut. It shall not be open. None shall enter by it. For the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it. Therefore it shall remain shut. Only the prince, because he's a prince, may sit on it to eat before the Lord, shall enter by the way, the vestibule, the gate, and go out by the same way. So that's obviously about the perpetual virginity of Mary, and Orthodox affirm that. Can we be sinless in this life according to Orthodoxy? The answer is absolutely yes. This is very scary, right? Because we don't want to accept this, but this is actually plainly what the saints teach. St. John Chrysostom says that you're completely not subject to the passions anymore in baptism. Completely. You go, oh, well, that's a real long time ago. St. Nikolai Ezekiel, I quoted in my Facebook today, said something to the same effect. The question is then, why do we still sin? St. Maximus, St. Gregory Nyssa, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, they all give the same answer. Actually, also, we just read this, St. Mark the Ascetic. We just had an episode on that, I think, on Wednesday. It's because we don't fully cooperate with the grace of God. The Theotokos did at the Annunciation. Theotokos always cooperated with the grace of God. That's why she did not sin. All right? So this sinless life is possible. That's why she did sin. Also, by the way, St. John the Baptist and St. Jeremiah were pre-purified in the womb, which is why they didn't sin their whole lives as well. So they fully cooperated with the grace of God from the womb. I could read you things about St. John the Baptist, about him never having a passion ever, which, quite frankly, is much higher language than I've even seen used in Theotokos, the Orthodox tradition. It's not because I think they venerate St. John the Baptist more. We don't. It's just that people don't realize how much we venerate St. John the Baptist in the Orthodox tradition. And so Shining Diamond has this little note. Ezekiel 44 teaches infant baptism is necessary. I'm guessing it talks about water sprinkling or something. We Orthodox believe that infants are sinless, but they're still purified by baptism. Why? Because they get the grace of God, and as long as they cooperate with that grace from that baptism, they don't ever have to sin, right? They still have a fallen will, so they'll always have to turn from every passion. All right, and I lost my cam. Turn from every passion. I may not get my cam back, and cooperate with the grace of God. And I don't know if this cam's coming back. All right, I'm just going to stay like this for a while. All right, sorry guys. So that being said, if you have any more questions, you can keep asking. I'm just going to do my plug here. Has this show blessed you? Well, don't bless me. Bless the Orthodox Church of Cambodia. You go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, like you see rolling at the bottom of the screen. Or you can go ko-fi.com/Orthodox Mission in Cambodia. You become a monthly contributor to the Orthodox churches in Cambodia. They have parishes in Siem Reap, in Sihanoukville, and in Phnom Penh. And you could bring the gospel, you could bring the sacraments and the Orthodox faith where it's never been before. So please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, or if you want to be a patron of this channel and be a committed supporter of the Church of Cambodia, go to ko-fi.com/Orthodox Mission in Cambodia, ko-fi.com/Orthodox Mission in Cambodia. So that is my plug. I'll answer one last question and we'll call it a day. What about other religious individuals that seem more holy than many Orthodox? Great question. Being Orthodox does not give you monopoly on being good or being a jerk. That's for darn sure. Man is by nature good. So man by nature could do good things, which is why people that aren't even Christians could live better lives, so to say. But what they can't do is actually cooperate with the grace of God to be Christ-like, because they don't know Christ. So that's why they don't go to heaven. So works aren't like how we earn salvation, right? We attain to salvation by faith alone, in the sense that it's only by believing in Christ and cooperating him, manifesting that faith through works, that faith becomes perfected, that we then actually cooperate with the grace of God, live in him, live the Christ-like life, which will be dispassionate and for eternity. All right. We have a question from Red Ribbon. Did the Annunciation function as a sort of baptism with Theotokos? The answer is absolutely. This is explicit in the St. Leo the Great's, I think, 23rd homily. It's also explicit in, I believe, the 16th hymn of St. Ephrem the Syrian. They both call it baptism. So the answer is yes. But you have to get out of your minds that, oh, Mary was baptized. It's because she committed all sorts of sins beforehand. Infants are baptized. They don't commit all sorts of sins beforehand. So the Orthodox don't view it that way. We do view it as a baptism. And it would be from original sin being a baptism. But we also believe that Mary attained theosis at this point in the most literal sense. The hypostatic union occurred in her womb, right? So she fully cooperated with God in a way a man never could. She bore God in the flesh. So she attains a theosis. And so by fully cooperating with that baptism, right? Go, well, how do you still sin after baptism? Well, Mary didn't, because she fully cooperated with the grace of God. So that is the answer to that question. Well, guys, I wish I could say goodbye to you on camera, but oh well, it's not working. And so I'll just say goodbye to you with this. And I will end with these words from the book of Wisdom of Sirach. And it says, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. Sirach 4:28. God bless you. Have a good day.